This is the continuation of the presentation I was doing earlier on the central nervous system, and we'll be carrying it on here with PowerPoint B. The first one was 12A. It's there on Blackboard. If you want to follow along or look at it independently, you certainly can. And this is where we get into, we basically did the cerebral lobes, which you'll be able to see in the section. And the next area is white matter, which is deep to it. Underneath the cortex, which is on the exterior, you have white matter. Three different kinds, by definition. White matter because they're covered in myelin, which insulates them, makes them fast. Every major nerve that you'll talk about is all about white matter. And so I thought I would continue with the presentation on that. And we will talk about the three different types. Pardon me, I have a text I have to respond to, and I did. And these are the three types. The one I talked about before was the corpus callosum. This is by definition a commissural fiber. It means it goes from right to left and left to right. So the right side knows what the left side's doing. Projection fibers are up and down. So basically, they're white matter that's either sending the signal down for motor activities or bringing the signals up for sensory activity or a mixture thereof. And association fibers are the third. They're only on one side or the other side. So an association fiber will be either on the right or on the left, though it's on both sides, certainly, but they don't communicate with one another. They basically carry the signals from the right side forward or sometimes even backwards, but mostly forward from the sensory area to the motor area, effectively processing. So that's what they are about. So their association fibers run horizontally, that's side to side as opposed to up and down, or front to back rather. Commissural across, and projection fibers, and there's two major ones, okay, that where we have the internal capsule. Something that's interesting, you actually can sometimes see it on the dissection, but you can definitely see the corona radiata, which means radiating crown, just like coronaviruses. Corona means crown, and that has to do with on the virus with the exterior sort of packaging of it. And this is a very important one that carries all of the sensory information that is collected in the thalamus, and that's really the relay point. The thalamus kind of it receives it, sorts it, and relays it to the appropriate part of the brain. Let me give you a good diagram here. Corpus callosum you see here, and directly over it as you cut through it, you'll be right inside the ventricles. In red, you can see these association fibers sort of taking it from point A to point B, and the up and down in sort of this bluish color, the projection fibers. And you'll see if you look backwards how the fibers crisscross. Fancy word is called decussation. That means they crisscross, and typically that's right in the area of the medulla anteriorly, and most of the time that's something has a distinctive structure called the pyramids, which we'll see. And now you can see a little bit here is that corpus callosum with the green, and then you can see the radiating fibers that are there from the corona radiata, and then in red, the association fibers. The basal nuclei, and in the old days we used to call them ganglia, but nuclei is the better term. And these nuclei have the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. But for our purposes, because when you look at them in sections, when they slice them, they look like they have stripes. They were collectively called the corpus striatum. So that's an important term because that it has to do with a pathway that plays a role in Parkinson's. That has to do with dopamine fibers coming from the midbrain going to the corpus striatum. And so that's fancy terms. I do it in a lecture, not for lab. It's called the nigrostriatal dopamine pathway, but that's really the pathway that's implicated in a lot of Parkinson's diseases. So you'll take a look at this. You don't have to know just that the basal nuclei are deep to it, and they're associated with that substantia nigra in the midbrain where the dopamine is made, and a lot of these nuclei that are around the diencephalon. So it's really that's where Parkinson's really gets itself, and this is what it looks like. So this is just a big collection. You can sometimes see a little bit of this on the dissection of the brain, and you'll be able to make out this sort of internal structure on either side of the thalamus, which is deep to it, which we're going to get to shortly. And when it says, when every time you see something in a PowerPoint or a presentation that says looks like, or thought to, or maybe, the short answer to that is we're not sure, we don't know. So yeah, it plays a role in movement, emotion, and cognition. So people with, for instance, with vis-a-vis Parkinson's, sometimes they act very unemotionally. They have difficulty, it appears, understanding things, difficulty with these slow movements, and particularly these unnecessary movements. The other one is very famously called Huntington's disease, or Huntington's chorea. That's not K. That's Chorea. Chorea means movement disorders collectively, and so, and a lot of times we'll see these. There, and this is what it looks like when you have this sort of like a striped look that you begin to see here a little bit. So, we see sections that look like little stripes to some of the anatomists. The diencephalon, very important, and the largest structure by far is the thalamus. The hypothalamus is a small triangular area directly below it, as the name would suggest, and on the upper outer, sort of the dorsolateral aspect of something called the epi, which epi means outside of thalamus, and that's really the pineal or pineal gland, which is kind of plays sort of a dual role in both central nervous system and endocrine, which you also see in the dissection, and they're all surrounded, or they surround that third ventricle, that fluid-filled area that's sort of in the midst, and it's right around here. So here's the epithalamus here, or the pineal gland. Here's the thalamus, the largest structure. It's like two eggs that have like an adhesion in between them. And here's the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is critical because that's the link between the brain and the pituitary gland. We call it the neuroendocrine link, nervous system to endocrine system. So what happens when our brain receives information, and the hypothalamus, the blood-brain barrier, is kind of weak, so it senses chemical levels, sugar levels, salt levels, a variety of levels in the bloodstream. And what it's able to do is then inform the pituitary gland, and indeed, up this back or posterior part of the pituitary gland is actually a little tongue-like projection. Uh, that's really more central nervous system tissue. So it's interesting about the pituitary. The anterior part is glandular, and the posterior part is really nerve tissue. And what comes out of that posterior part are really neurotransmitters, chemicals that are made by the brain. And you can see it on an actual prosected specimen, which you can see here, not as quite as distinctly, but here's the thalamic and the hypothalamic area that are there. So the thalamus, again, it's rather substantial, and there's a little adhesion that holds them together. And schematically, you have all of these sections. In advanced anatomy, we'll look at these more closely, but effectively, mostly sensory signals coming from all the sensors in your body are sort of processed and directed in the appropriate direction from here. So sort, editing, and relaying plays a role interacting with hypothalamic activity. Uh, so it modifies some of the signals that the hypothalamus relieves to make sure that the appropriate response is there. Uh, it also the cerebellum is sensing every little impulse, every movement, and what it does is it basically takes all of this information, whether it's coming from the basal nuclei, from the cerebellum, from your active movements, and basically processes it. So there's a lot, and memory plays a role in this. So it really functions with sensory and motor activities. When they talk about cortical arousal, it's being awake or alert. Learning and memory are all parts. It's really vital. The hypothalamus has the mammillary bodies. They relay smell. They play a very important role in our emotions. Smell really triggers an emotion. The infundibulum is a little stalk that comes down from the hypothalamus that the pituitary gland attaches. And then these are all these sensors, all these different named nuclei in the hypothalamus that, because the blood-brain barrier is weak, are able to sense and make adjustments. So all of that is critical for homeostasis. It's critical for the autonomic nervous system, blood pressure, heartbeat, digestion, eyes, all of these things. And there's also, because we have our emotions, we get physical response. You get angry about something, your heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, pupils, we call it fight or flight, your pupils dilate. There's a lot of in play that's here. And it also, as you can see, sweating, shivering, hunger and thirst, sleep and waking cycles. There's just a tremendous amount that goes on here. And then, as you can see, when we have problems here, these are real difficulties. So isn't it, this would be eating disorders, not so much eating disorders that are brought about by depression or other factors, but this would be real hypothalamic problems or body wasting or these kinds of things are sometimes, they're more targeted to having damage to that area as opposed to depression type of things. So these are more physiological than psychological. And you can see sure, cancers can do it, radiation exposure, surgery, trauma, injuries, all of these infections, they all can play a role. In the pineal gland, not a lot to it. It does play a role in sleep or wake cycles. This is where melatonin is made. Melatonin does tend to help us, it's sort of an important factor in sleep. You got to be careful. You can take it as a supplement, but some people really overreact and become very difficult to wake or drive a car or operate machinery. You got to be very careful. That type of thing. And now we really see this is the remaining portion, including the brain stem. So this is where we're looking at midbrain. We're looking here at the pons, which has sort of the ridging, those sulci and gyri going in the opposite direction, transversely rather than sort of forward and back, where they come more like this. These are called the peduncles. That's really the fibers, all your body telling your brain, telling your body what muscles to move. They're called the cerebral peduncles or the corticospinal tract. Here's the thalamus. A lot of cranial nerves, basically, other than the first cranial nerve way up here, all the rest. And I'll review the cranial nerves before we do the dissection, just so you have an idea what you're looking for. Oops. So, and you'll see the olfactory nerve, the optic nerves that are cut, it's called the optic chiasm. You'll probably see the oculomotor nerve here. Some will see the trochlear. Depending on the specimen, they may have the stumps of the giant trigeminal. And then every so often, I even get one of these abducens. The rest of these are just like little threads because it's such a small area that are there. But you can see how the thalamus, because this area, maybe in a sheep, is maybe a couple of inches. And you and I, maybe it's a little longer, but not dramatically so. And then from the side, this is how they look. There's the pituitary gland in the back, and you'll see these on the dissection as you look from behind. You'll see two masses, one one on top of the other. In us, the superior is larger. In animals, the inferior sometimes is a little bit larger. They're called the colliculi. And what's interesting on the back of them is kind of where we move our heads to sights and sounds. Just like you catch something out of the corner of your eye, your head will move to it. You hear a sound like a horn or an ambulance. You know how you start to move your head to see where it's coming from, particularly if you're in the car. So that's what they do. They're head and neck, sight and sound reflexes. Very important. And so they're sort of intimately associated between the midbrain, which they're part of in the back, and the thalamus that they play a role in. And all of these peduncles are all tracts of fibers going either up from the cerebellum, down from the cerebellum, across from the cerebellum, etc. These are those colliculi from the back, superior and inferior, the pineal glands right in between them. You actually get a pretty good view of this on the dissection. Trochlear nerve is the only nerve that comes from the back. Sometimes you see it. This is the very large fourth ventricle. And these areas are called choroid plexes. This is really where the finalization of the cerebrospinal fluid comes from. And much of the time, we'll see that in the lateral, the third and the fourth ventricles, where they are. And then the brainstem, by definition, midbrain, pons, and medulla. They're very similar to the spinal cord, but they don't have the characteristic dark gray matter butterfly. It's all about autonomic or automatic behaviors, 10 of the 12 cranial nerves. So then once you get into this area, these control what you don't even think about your body doing, heart rate and blood pressure and breathing and flow of blood and directing the blood to the appropriate areas. If there's damage to the brainstem, people are in trouble. When there's a big bad accident or a terrible stroke or a tumor in the brainstem, not good news. They're likely not going to survive very long. So there are the peduncles, and the aqueduct's just a channel through the midbrain. I'll show it to you. And we'll look, and so this is the midbrain. There's the aqueduct. It's a little bit larger than the canal, gray matter around it. And then these very interesting, is kind of interesting, they call this the red nucleus, and these the substantia nigra, which means black stuff. And these are where a lot of neurotransmitters are produced that play an important role. The reticular formation is one of the structures in there, has to do with our being alert, awake and alert, things like that. These are the pyramidal tracts, those ones that make up those big peduncles. And that's where there's an immense amount of fibers coming down from your brain telling your body how to move. So they really are an important part. So it's very distinctive. You have some gray matter in the colliculi in the back. The pons, again, very distinctive because it's fairly large compared to the midbrain and the medulla. And the fibers in the front, anteriorly, run across rather than up and down. So it's kind of interesting. It's a big connector and a relay center between the cerebellum with all the motor activity that the cerebellum is kind of recording and processing and remembering. Cranial nerves are there. And again, this is really, we're starting to get to these structures that breathing and blood pressure and heart rate that we don't even think about, but are vital to us surviving. So the fourth ventricle is now quite large and visible there. More reticular formation, the giant trigeminal nerve really is what gives it away in the cross section. Lots of nuclei and more of those pyramidal fibers. So again, you might have a little bit of gray matter, maybe some little islands that are there, and that's about it. And then lastly, and famously, the medulla, this oblong area. Okay, choroid plexus that you will see, and the best thing is to show it to you because I'll get the cutaway. Here it is. Here you can see the choroid plexus. The fourth ventricle is even larger. The cerebellum's behind it, here and behind the pons. Lots of these little islands for cranial nerves. The pyramids now appear as these sort of mounds with the bases here. So it's sort of like, rather than the pointy Egyptian pyramid, more of the Central American, like the Mayan pyramid, sort of. And that's, I don't know if that's where how they make the distinction. And all the functions that, all of these are things that basically keep us alive. The cerebellum, you have to mention, about 11% of the brain mass, dorsal to the pons and the medulla, so it's behind it and back of it, processes inputs from everywhere. The brain stem, sensory receptors, all this information is constantly being processed, telling you where your body is and how to make adjustments to maintain it. Think you're standing in line, you're in a grocery store, your shift, every little movement, every little position. Your brain is constantly remembering what to do. So you get ready to check out. Let's say you're putting groceries on the conveyor belt, or maybe you're just doing it yourself at a checkout, and all the little things that you do, and then certainly balance is part of it. So these are the second largest area, about 10% of your brain. And again, the fibers are oriented transversely rather than up and down or longitudinally. And what's most interesting about this has more synapses, more connections almost than anywhere else in the brain. So there's a tremendous amount of information processing, the memory that we have, all those things that you and I do without thinking. Getting up, sitting down, walking to the car, going to class, getting on your computer and starting to look for a website. All that stuff's sort of pre-recorded in memories that are stored there, and basically you activate them. Oh, hey, I got to turn on my computer. You go do that. Do you think I have to move the cursor to here or press this button or enter these letters? No, just do it. So it's really very interesting. And so what's in it, and this is what a real view, this white matter has a very distinct tree-like appearance. So the old, let's say the Renaissance anatomists said, oh, this must be the tree of life. So they called it the arbor vitae, which means tree of life. And here it is sort of diagrammatically, and you can see cortex, gray matter, white matter, and then more gray matter on the outside. And again, other than the cerebral cortex, you really don't see that. The very large fourth ventricle, here's the pons, here's the medulla, there's a little bit of midbrain, there are the colliculi. And that's kind of what you see with it. So a tremendous amount of information processing. It's funny because the ancient anatomy, so there's like a little person in there sort of directing traffic. Kind of neat. And I'm going to leave you with that. I have a few more things to discuss. We'll do it in lab before we get ready for the dissection to finish this on the central nervous system and a little bit about the spinal cord, and we'll be good to go. Thank you.